And now we come to the Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865. Before we discuss how a white man's war to save the Union turned into a war for the abolition of slavery, let's reflect on what led to the war. We talked about secession earlier, and very clearly the secession of at least the first Deep South Confederate States was over the issue of slavery. But technically, if we were to put this mathematically, does secession equal war? In theory, after the Southern states seceded, Lincoln could have spoken for the Union, what was left of the Union, by saying the South is making a big mistake, they're going to regret it, come back on their bended knees in a few years, but let's let them go their way and do what they want to do. That could have happened. It's hard to think that way, knowing the way in which events did unfold. But let's change that mathematical formula a bit. Secession over slavery plus unionism equals war. That makes more sense. Unionism is a very crucial factor in understanding the coming of the Civil War. The North's commitment to preserving the Union and their belief that it was impossible for the Union of States to be dissolved, that was a crucial factor. Secession over slavery plus unionism equals war. When the North said, no, you can't do that, when the Southern states seceded from the Union, the war began. The war began at Fort Sumter, a federal fort off the coast of South Carolina. This was an interesting location. Notice I said it's a federal fort, but within a Confederate state. So, who claimed Fort Sumter? Neither side agreed. When Lincoln sent a mission to resupply the federal troops stationed at Fort Sumter, the Confederacy blocked this attempt. When shots were fired at Fort Sumter, this sparked the Civil War. And as we've seen before, the last wave of Confederate states seceded at that point. A general overview of Civil War strategy would include the Anaconda Plan. The Union wanted to be able to divide the South. They were fighting to the east and to the west, and they followed the strategy of the anaconda, the watery snake that surrounds its victims and strangles them, in blockading all the waterways. The Atlantic Ocean to the east, Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, hoping to cut off the South from important supplies. You'll read about some of the early battles in the war, including the first Battle of Bull Run, Shiloh, and Antietam. Obviously, many people underestimated what they were getting into at the beginning of the Civil War. The Battle of Bull Run certainly proved to be no picnic, as many expected. And as the war dragged on and more casualties fell every day, it became clear that Lincoln needed a new strategy in order to move the war forward. There was growing pressure to consider freeing slaves in the South as a military measure in order to advance the Union war effort. During the war, some of the Union generals had practiced seizing Southern slaves as contraband of war, and in doing so, they were weakening the Confederate strength. Keep in mind that slaves, while in bondage in the Confederacy, whether or not they wanted to, were supporting the war effort. Usually, neither the Confederacy nor the Union, neither army, was willing to put guns in the hands of African Americans to help them fight for their cause. There were some exceptions, like the 54th Massachusetts. But behind the scenes, whether the African Americans were raising crops or digging trenches or garrisoning, they were contributing to the war effort. And Lincoln was aware that taking that asset away from the South and putting it to work for the North could tip the balance of the war. But politically, Lincoln faced a more complicated dilemma. In August of 1862, in a letter to Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, Lincoln said the following: "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it; and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it; and if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." We know that Lincoln was personally opposed to slavery, but as president, remember, a politician by necessity, it wasn't as simple as getting his way. Lincoln knew that it was important to have the support of some border states like Kentucky. Remember, Kentucky was a slave state, which had remained loyal to the Union, and Lincoln was afraid of losing that important state. When the North declared war on the Confederacy, certainly they were doing so in the name of preserving the Union. Even at that point, they were not threatening to abolish slavery. And if you look at the rank and file Northern soldiers, read their diaries, you will see that generally the cause that they believed they were fighting for was to save the Union. Sometimes they themselves were quite racist and certainly didn't see this as a war to liberate the slaves. That was in the beginning of the war. But as I've said, the war dragged on, and something had to change. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he stated that effective New Year's Day, 1863, all of the slaves in Confederate areas would be free. Slaves in loyal Union areas like Kentucky would remain slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a halfway measure at abolishing slavery. It was a step towards abolition, but it was certainly a wartime measure aimed at crippling the Confederacy. By the time Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in November of 1863, we see an important shift in the aims of the war. He is not only talking about the effort to hold the Union together, but he is referring to liberty and equality, breathing a whole new meaning into the Union war effort. I believe it's fair to say that the slaves who were set free once the Union Army put the Emancipation Proclamation into effect, that the former slaves took this white man's war for the Union and turned it into a war for their freedom. By serving the Union war effort and making a difference in the outcome of the war, they fought for their freedom. At the end of the war, with the 13th Amendment, this was accomplished. Slavery was abolished everywhere, not just in the Confederate States. What does it take to win a war? It takes manpower. The North had started out with an advantage. It takes money. The North had started out with an advantage there as well. They were more industrialized than the Confederacy. But throughout the war, both the Union and the Confederacy came under strain. They both resorted to drafts, and there was growing resentment and opposition. There were draft riots in some northern cities. You'll also read about some of the later battles of the Civil War, such as Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864 and Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox in 1865. In considering the legacy or the consequences of the Civil War, one important thing to note is the 13th Amendment. When the Civil War led to the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, this was a huge irony. At the beginning of the war, neither the North nor the South intended or expected this to be the result of the war. Remember, the Union went to war to keep the Union together. The Confederacy left, obviously wanting to preserve slavery, certainly not set it on the road to extinction. So the way in which this war to save the Union turned out to be the war that ended slavery is very significant, a great historical irony. Another important part of the outcome or the legacy of the Civil War is the preservation of the Union. It certainly isn't true that after the Civil War, all the former Confederates said, you know, you're right, secession really was illegal, we were wrong. No, I'm not saying that everyone agreed on principles of unionism, but as a practical matter, the issue seemed to be settled. For decades before, people had talked about nullification and secession and not really come to an understanding about what a state could or could not do. After the Civil War, for all their differences, we never saw another example of states attempting to leave the Union in such a manner. The Civil War also resulted in an unintended revolution in the South. If you think about it, the Confederacy was intended as a conservative movement, wanting to keep things the way they had been in the South, with slavery and the agricultural economy and democratic politics and everything. But throughout the course of the war, much of this, ironically, was disrupted. The Southern economy had to change in order to meet wartime demand. Taxes had to rise. Socially, not only did this lead to the abolition of slavery, but also changing roles for women in the South, who often were forced to take over control of the plantations in the absence of their husbands, and very often resented their new duties. There was political upheaval as well after the war, when former slaves for a while were seen voting and electing Republican candidates. Again, much of the outcomes of the Civil War were ironic. And of course there were the casualties, not just lives lost in the war, but other types of wounds, emotional wounds, and bitterness between the North and the South that would take a long time to heal. As you'll see in the next lecture, there was a great deal of rebuilding to be done.